Welcome back. In my previous video, I spoke of the history of my comic and all the unused ideas that I had. In this video, I'll talk about 8 tips that I have for anyone who wish to try and make a comic of their own. Let's not waste any time and get to it. In the past, I had some people ask me for advice with their ideas for a comic series, and typically they would tell me about the plot, the characters, the setting, and maybe they'll show some piece of concept art, and yeah, that's technically like a pitch, something to grab the attention of someone, but what I consider to be more important is something to make the reader come back for more. Even the best run comic might end up being bland and lifeless, while a crummy piece of garbage like 7-Pack, for example, can make someone laugh. It's important to engage your audience and make them feel emotions, depending on what genre you're working with. Comedy, romance, drama, horror, or shooting fish in a barrel. Your readers must know what your story offers, and that more of it will come in the future. I do have to stress that this might not even be about delivering, and more about advertising. There was a friend I had who didn't read my comic for many years, and one day, when he was really bored, he decided to take a look at it, and he was surprised that it was a very comedic comic. All this time, I showed him designs for the characters, weapons, superpowers, symbols, which gave him the impression that it was some serious fantasy story, which he didn't care for. He ignored it because I presented it in an inaccurate way. Of course, there could be an audience for a story like that, but a comedy could certainly reach a wider audience. Plus, with my poor skills as an artist, it was good that I went with the comedy route. Just wish I had made that clearer to everyone from the very beginning. A silly comic that might make you laugh. Might not sound like much, but it was enough to keep a few people following my story for years. It's certainly better than something like a story with a really cool protagonist, or a comic about how much smarter the author is from everyone else, or preachy political whining. So be sure to think about what your comic's strong point should be, and make it clear to the people, and you might keep readers interested for years to come. The question of how to write a good story is a very broad topic, one that I could never cover within a short span of time, but I can mention a mistake that many young writers make: writing fanfiction. I'm not trying to say that all works of fiction based on copyrighted properties are bad, but they present some problems, especially if one wants to make a long-running series. To throw a random example, let's say someone was a fan of the 90s Disney cartoon, let's say Quack Pack, and they wanted to create a comic about Huey, Dewey, and Louie being a bit older, going to high school, and discovering the Midnight Channel from Persona 4. Even if this was a good comic, no publisher would ever print it, because it's a copyrighted property. And if you'd apply for a job as a comic artist and show this, you'd raise some eyebrows. If you are truly a good artist or good writer, why do you rely on the ideas of other people? Why can't you just create something of your own? Don't get me wrong, taking inspiration is fine, but try not to go overboard with it to where it's debatable if you actually own your story. And yeah, I know all the stuff that some might say. This is just a small project for myself. It's just for fun. I don't plan to show this outside of my online gallery, which might be true now. However, there's always that risk that you'll commit years of your life to your project, and then one day you'll want to do more with it, and your hands will be tied. Remember, it's better to do the difficult chore of being original than to suffer the consequences of being an imitation. As with the last point, the topic of designing characters could take a long time to cover, so I'll just focus on the size. When initially designing 7-pack, I looked at series such as Sailor Moon, Digimon or Persona and thought to myself, wow, these shows have so many characters. My comic should have a lot of characters as well. 6 at the start and a 7th one to be revealed later. And oh boy, was that a dumb idea or what? Instead of focusing on who I really needed, I just picked a number and tried to fill the role based on cheap gimmicks. Raphael was the gamer, Joseph was the religious guy, and Steve was supposed to be a huge fan of TV and The Simpsons. Much to my surprise, it turns out that making references to video games or TV shows isn't real comedy, so that was off the table. Also, making a character religious didn't do much, so that was scrapped as well. Raphael at least was a very active character in the plot, always wanting to go on adventures, so he ended up playing an actual role. But Joseph and Steve felt like lesser versions of other characters, and here I was thinking of adding a 7th character. Laughable. Some might argue that almost all shows have some weaker characters, so it's not a big deal, but it's important to keep my personal perspective in mind here. I was one single guy drawing the whole thing, and being very slow at it, because I had school and work to deal with. It was also my very first comic. I was extremely inexperienced. Now I know better. All those chapters focusing on Joseph and Steve, they didn't need to exist. All the group shots where I showed the full cast, that could have been faster to draw if they didn't exist. Other situations would have been simpler to deal with too, like memorizing the colors of everything everyone wore, remembering what items everyone carried with them, and where everyone stood in every scene. It's a ton of extra work, especially if you're just one single person. This is why I advise young aspiring artists to keep the cast small. As the old saying goes, less is more. For once, a more technical question. How would you like to release your comic? Small comic strips with no strong ongoing story, or entire pages that tell a lengthy tale? Or how about a question on your release schedule? How frequently will you publish things? If you imagine taking lengthy breaks between releases, then comic strips will suffer much less from a hiatus. Half a year between page 12 and 13 of a chapter, on the other hand, is far more frustrating to the reader. There are multiple ways of approaching this. Just release things as you finish them, no matter how their readers feel. Finish the comic chapter first, then publish everything at once. Or finish the comic chapter first, then release the pages at a daily or weekly schedule. The first definitely works for people who could keep up with it all. I definitely failed at it, and that's why I dropped it. The second was advised to me by some, but I hate the idea that I worked on something for months and people will just comment on 1 or 2 pages and that's that. The third is what I ended up using for a long part of my comic's lifespan. It was a bit frustrating at times, but I feel like it worked for me. Perhaps to some, all these things might sound like unimportant details. but they do impact how reading your comic feels like. Even something silly like deciding to only put out your comic in small resolution could impact you badly if you ever need it for anything of the sort, like wanting them printed out or using them for a really dumb video. What I went with was a continuous narrative released on a weekly basis with events written in a way where the end of a page tended to contain a joke, letting the readers have a chuckle almost every week. Of course, you can take a different approach, but be sure that it suits what you are trying to create. I remember that a long time ago, I spent a lot of time thinking of amazing stories that could happen in my comic. All the amazing superpowers and weapons that my cast would wield. I saw an incredible future ahead of myself, which, thinking about now, was really dumb. Sure, these ideas did excite me, they did pump me up, but I clearly overdid it. I wasn't thinking about the current chapter. I wasn't thinking about what I had to do right now. I was focusing on what I'd do in the future, when my comic became very popular, which it never did. To be fair, I managed to put in some of what I had planned from the start, but I didn't succeed at making it as good as I imagined. For example, I was inspired by series such as Digimon and Persona, and that's why I added the Daimon into the story, and had them appear in Chapter 2 already, but they didn't speak, they were not given a name until the very end of the comic. I did intend for them to turn into weapons and later even fuse with the heroes, giving them super forms, but I didn't really go through with that. I was just getting tired. I knew I wasn't even utilizing the basic magical powers of my characters that well, so why even bother introducing even greater superpowers? It was meant as a means of delivering even bigger stories, but in the end, I realized that those were not the kinds of stories that I wanted to tell. If I was to remake the comic, I'd probably remove them completely. Honestly, I could potentially remove the other world as well and keep things in the normal environment. It cut a lot of the fat from the premise, that's for sure. You should never forget that your actions will have consequences, which is why you must keep a critical mind and question if what you're thinking of is a good idea or just sounds like one. To be fair, I didn't put all my ideas into my comic, as I mentioned in my previous video, so one could argue that things could have been a lot worse. Heck, I even planned out an animated version of my comic and was considering what anime-style opening it should have. It's not bad to brainstorm, but you should not lose track of what's directly in front of you now. If you want to dream big, you have to work hard first. Let me tell you a story. There was once a comic artist who created a comic about, being a gentleman. His friends enjoyed his comic and wanted to become gentlemen in the comic as well. Then the comic attracted the attention of big artists who also wanted to appear in the comic. And eventually some people were willing to pay for getting in as well. As much as it was a comic about being a gentleman, the author clearly had an idea of where the story should go. However, because he was spending so much time squeezing in his friends, the cameos, and people who paid to be there was no time to progress anything, and the comic just stopped. No more pages were ever made. There's an important lesson to be learned. Putting people into your comic comes with risks. They are not your creations. They are actual people. You might not have complete freedom to do with them as you please. It may mess with how you're telling your story. For a long time, I had friends asking me if they could appear in my comic. I kept saying no, until one day during chapter 5, I decided to let it all go and create a page for all the cameos. At the time, I felt quite clever about my approach, making it into an over-the-top thing, but in hindsight, it was a terrible idea. Time passed and various things have happened. I no longer keep in touch with some of these people. I have gotten into arguments with some. We grew distant and don't qualify as friends anymore. And some are no longer with us, giving the whole page a very sad feeling. Of course, there is an argument to be made that it's just one page. True, I put Combarta into my comic as a recurring character as well, but we're still friends as of the timing of this recording, so it's no biggie. That's true. But it made me realize what can come from a simple cameo appearance. You never know what the future can hold for you and your friends. And besides, only you, the author, may even know the people you put into your comic. It may seem like a nice gesture, but it may not even mean anything to your average reader. So be careful and think twice before you put real people into your comic. It might backfire. Okay, so I mentioned a lot of things to avoid. Some of you may now have some regrets over what you've put together so far and feel like throwing everything away and either giving up or starting over. I must insist that you don't do that. Perhaps you have something good going on and it'd be better to just write it out than start from the beginning. I made these mistakes, but if I could go back in time, I would not change a thing. That whole dumb idea of an animated version of 7-Pack? It may seem like a waste, but by looking for voice actors, I made some new friends, and they are among the dearest people in my life. Even if the animation idea went nowhere, I did gain something most valuable from it. So don't take what I'm talking about here as absolute truths, or that following my tips will make you happier. It's not necessarily the case. Also, I urge people to be careful with what I call the remake trap. I've seen creators decide to stop their passion project, put up a journal entry saying that they'll redo everything better than ever, and more often than not, that's the last I ever hear from them. People most often do this because they don't feel satisfied with what they're creating, feeling confident that if the comic was perfect, they'd have the motivation to carry on. But as soon as they fall into that whole mindset of a perfect vision, they never manage to make that first page good enough, and with that, the comic dies right there. Not to mention, redoing what you did before always felt really annoying to me. I had days where I sat in Photoshop for 2 hours, then the program crashed, and I had to redraw everything. But instead of just redrawing it for 2 hours, I typically needed 2 days before sitting back to it because I simply felt too annoyed. Now imagine this mindset, but it's not for a little bit of work, but years of labor. It's no wonder people give up. And to use the literary masterpiece Tails Gets Trolled as an example, chances are your audience won't even want a polished version of your story, and you'd be better off just creating more pages. Remember the mistakes of your past so you don't repeat them in the future. And the final tip is about knowing when to end your comic. This isn't something that every comic needs, comic strips especially, but if you are creating an ongoing narrative, you should think about when things should conclude.
But wait a minute, Farrell, didn't you just talk about not giving up? What's this about an ending?
Listen up. This is the polar opposite of the previous point. Instead of giving up way too early, an artist might make their comic run for decades. Admirable, for sure, but how long can you go on? Do you really only want to be known for one single series? Wouldn't it be better to simply give it a satisfying conclusion? My comic has been running for over a decade, with me constantly regretting the decisions that I made back in high school when I was planning all of this out. I'd keep all my thoughts as things that I'll never do again. But would there ever even be a next time? Seems like I'm stuck with my comic the way it is. This is why I ended up deciding that it was time to end. Even if there is a chance that I will never make another webcomic, I wanted things to end. And to make one important detail clear here, it's not like I made the decision and stopped working on my comic in the middle of a chapter. I spent more than 2 years working on a proper conclusion, which includes this and the previous video. I didn't leave my readers with nothing. So while I do insist that authors should know when to move on to other projects, they have to also give it their best to give their life's work a conclusion that it deserves. And with that, I'd like to conclude my video. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope these tips will help you with your own comics, and I wish you the best of luck.